Shock indictment tonight. The so-called cruise ship girl, Anna Kapner, a little teen girl, found stuffed under the bed on a Carnival cruise ship. Tonight, an indictment goes down as we learn, according to court documents, this teen girl brutally sex assaulted before she is strangled dead. At the same time, the alleged killer, her own stepbrother, is unmasked.
The ocean was calm that night. The kind of calm that makes everything feel safe, predictable, almost perfect. A massive cruise ship cut through the dark waters, glowing with soft lights. Laughter spilling from its decks, music echoing into the open air. Families were enjoying themselves, couples were dancing, and somewhere among them was a teenage girl named Anna Kapner, excited about what was supposed to be one of the happiest trips of her life. She had packed her favorite outfits, gotten her nails done, and looked forward to every moment on that ship, surrounded by family, surrounded by people who were supposed to protect her. But by the next day, that same ship would become the center of a chilling mystery. Anna had been traveling with her family, including her stepbrother, on what should have been a carefree vacation. Earlier that evening, everything seemed normal. They had dinner together, shared moments like any other family would, and there was nothing outwardly alarming about the night. At some point, Anna decided to head back to the cabin earlier than the rest. It wasn't unusual. Maybe she was tired, maybe she just wanted some quiet time. Either way, that decision would unknowingly mark the beginning of a timeline that investigators would later dissect minute by minute. Because that was the last time she was seen alive. Hours passed. The ship continued its journey across the ocean, blissfully unaware of the horror unfolding behind one of its many cabin doors. Night turned into morning, and still no one raised an alarm. No one checked on Anna. No one knocked on her door to make sure she was okay. Life on the cruise continued as if everything was perfectly fine. But something was very, very wrong. As the sun rose, passengers began heading to breakfast. The smell of food filled the air. People laughed, plates clinked, and the illusion of normalcy remained intact. Among those moving through the buffet line was Anna's stepbrother. By all accounts, he appeared calm, normal. Nothing about his behavior suggested panic, fear, or urgency. And yet, Anna was nowhere to be found. It wasn't until later that morning that concern finally began to grow. Questions started to surface. Where was Anna? Why hadn't anyone seen her since the night before? What started as mild confusion quickly shifted into something more serious. Staff members were alerted. A search began. And then came the moment that would change everything. A housekeeper entered one of the cabins during routine cleaning. At first, nothing seemed out of place. But then, something caught their attention. Beneath the bed, something didn't look right. As they moved closer and looked underneath, what they found would send shockwaves through the entire ship. Anna's body had been hidden there. She was wrapped tightly in a blanket, concealed in a way that suggested someone had gone to great lengths to hide her. Life jackets had been placed around her, almost as if someone believed this would keep her from being discovered. It was disturbing, calculated, and deeply unsettling. In that moment, the cruise ship was no longer a place of relaxation. It had become a crime scene. Panic spread quickly. Authorities were notified. The atmosphere shifted from carefree to chaotic. Guests whispered among themselves, trying to piece together what could have happened. How could something like this occur in such a confined space, surrounded by thousands of people? And more importantly, who could have done this? Investigators began their work immediately. The cabin was sealed off, and every detail became crucial. Signs of a struggle began to emerge. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't something that happened quietly or without resistance. There were indications that whatever happened in that room was violent, intense, and terrifying. As the timeline started to come together, one detail stood out above the rest. Someone had been in that room with her. As more information surfaced, attention began to shift toward those closest to Anna. The people who had access to that cabin. The people who were there that night. And slowly, a disturbing picture began to form. There were reports that during the night, sounds had been heard coming from the room. Not just ordinary noises, but something far more alarming. A younger sibling later described hearing raised voices, shouting, the sound of furniture being moved, or even thrown. It wasn't quiet, it wasn't subtle, it was loud enough to be remembered. And yet, no one intervened. Even more troubling was the claim that the younger sibling had been locked out of the room during this time. Locked out while something chaotic and frightening was happening inside. Locked out while Anna was still alive. That detail alone raised serious questions. What was happening behind that door? Why was no one stopping it? And how did it escalate to something so horrific? As investigators continued digging, suspicion began to center on one individual, Anna's stepbrother. The same person who had been seen at breakfast the next morning, acting as though everything was normal. The same person who had been in close proximity to her that night. The same person whose behavior, once examined more closely, began to raise red flags. But at this stage, nothing had been officially confirmed. What investigators did know was this: Anna had entered that room alive, and she never walked out. The evidence suggested a violent confrontation. The condition in which her body was found pointed to an attempt to conceal what had happened. This wasn't something that occurred in panic alone. It appeared deliberate. And as the reality of the situation began to sink in, one haunting question lingered over everything. How could something so brutal happen so close to family, and go unnoticed until it was too late? Because this wasn't just a random act of violence. This wasn't a stranger breaking in. This was something far more disturbing. Something that suggested the danger wasn't outside the cabin, but inside it. And as the investigation deepened, the truth that would begin to unfold was far darker than anyone on that ship could have imagined. Before we go further into what investigators uncovered next, make sure you subscribe to Midnight Casefiles, like this video, comment your thoughts, and share this story. Because cases like this deserve to be heard, and justice starts with awareness. What happened to Anna that night didn't just shock a cruise ship. It exposed something far more terrifying. The moment Anna's body was discovered, everything changed. What had started as confusion quickly turned into a full-scale investigation, and the quiet luxury of the cruise ship was replaced with tension, fear, and unanswered questions. Crew members moved with urgency, sections of the ship were restricted, and whispers spread from one passenger to another. People who had boarded for relaxation were now trapped in the middle of something deeply disturbing. Inside the cabin, investigators began piecing together what had happened. Every inch of that room mattered. The bed, the floor, the walls, each surface potentially held clues. And it didn't take long before one conclusion became unavoidable. This was not an accident. This was not something that happened quietly or without resistance. There had been a struggle, and it had been intense. Evidence suggested that Anna fought for her life. Forensic findings pointed to signs of violence that were impossible to ignore. The injuries she sustained indicated that she had been overpowered in a way that was both brutal and deliberate. There were indications of trauma that suggested she had been assaulted before her death. And then there was the method used to end her life, pressure applied to her neck in a way that would have cut off her ability to breathe. It wasn't quick, it wasn't painless, and it wasn't something that could be mistaken for anything other than intentional. As investigators worked through the physical evidence, they also began building a timeline. What happened that night? Who was where? Who saw what? And perhaps most importantly, who heard what? Because someone did hear something. A younger sibling came forward with a chilling account. During the night, he had heard yelling coming from inside the cabin. Not just raised voices, but aggressive shouting. Words spoken in anger. The kind of tone that makes you stop and listen. And it didn't end there. He described sounds of movement. Heavy movement. Furniture being pushed, maybe even thrown. It sounded chaotic. Violent. And then came a detail that made everything even more disturbing. He said he had been locked out of the room. Locked out while the shouting continued. Locked out while something clearly dangerous was unfolding inside. Locked out while Anna was still alive. That single detail changed everything. Because it suggested that whoever was inside that room knew exactly what they were about to do. It suggested intent. It suggested awareness. And it suggested that what happened next wasn't sudden or accidental. It was a choice. As this account was added to the growing body of evidence, attention turned sharply toward Anna's stepbrother. He had been in the room. He had been present during that critical window of time. And now, his actions before, during, and after the incident were being examined more closely than ever. Investigators began asking difficult questions. Why was the younger sibling locked out? Why were there reports of yelling and violence, yet no intervention? Why did the stepbrother appear calm the next morning? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what was his relationship with Anna really like? That's when a darker layer of the story began to surface. People close to Anna started speaking out. Friends, acquaintances, individuals who had observed interactions between her and her stepbrother. And what they described painted a picture that was deeply concerning. There were claims that the stepbrother had developed an unhealthy fixation on Anna, that his behavior toward her had crossed boundaries, that he made her uncomfortable. One account described an incident where he allegedly tried to get into her bed while she was asleep. Another suggested that his feelings toward her were not appropriate for a sibling relationship. And perhaps the most troubling part? There were claims that these concerns had been raised before. According to reports, Anna's boyfriend and even his father had warned her family. They had tried to alert them to the stepbrother's behavior. They had expressed concern that something wasn't right, that Anna didn't feel safe. But those warnings, it seemed, were not taken seriously. As this information became part of the investigation, it raised a painful question. Could this have been prevented? If those warnings had been acted upon, if boundaries had been enforced, if Anna had not been placed in the same room as someone she feared, would she still be alive? It's a question that lingers, heavy and unresolved. Meanwhile, investigators continue to analyze physical evidence. DNA testing, forensic swabs, and detailed examinations of the scene were all underway. Every fiber, every trace, every possible clue was being processed. In cases like this, the smallest detail can become the most important piece of the puzzle. And then there was the behavior after the fact. The way Anna's body had been hidden suggested more than panic. She had been wrapped carefully, concealed under the bed, surrounded by items meant to keep her out of sight. This wasn't a split-second decision. It was an attempt to cover up what had happened. And that raises another critical point. Hiding a body requires awareness. It requires the understanding that something wrong has been done. It requires the intent to avoid being caught. So how does that align with the idea that the suspect didn't know what he was doing? That question would soon become central to the legal battle. Because while investigators were building a case, the defense was already beginning to take shape. The suspect was only 16 years old, a minor, and that fact alone introduced a complex layer to the situation. His legal team would likely explore arguments related to his mental state, competency, insanity, the idea that he may not have fully understood the nature or consequences of his actions. But the prosecution would look at the same evidence and see something very different. They would point to the violence of the act, the sequence of events, the decision to isolate the victim, the attempt to hide the body, and they would argue that these actions demonstrate awareness, intent, and control. Two sides, two interpretations of the same night, and somewhere in between lies the truth. Before we go deeper into how this case moved from investigation to federal charges, take a moment to subscribe to Midnight Casefiles, like this video, comment your thoughts, and share it with others. Because stories like this don't just inform, they spark conversations that matter. As the investigation progressed, one thing became clear. This was no longer just a tragic incident on a cruise ship. It was a case that would test the limits of justice, responsibility, and accountability. By the time the investigation reached its next stage, the weight of what had happened could no longer be contained within the walls of that cruise ship. What started as a shocking discovery had now evolved into a full federal case. And with it came a development that would define everything that followed. An indictment. The stepbrother, just 16 years old, was formally charged. Not in juvenile court, not behind closed doors, but in federal court, facing the kind of accusations that carry life-altering consequences. Aggravated sexual assault, first-degree murder. Charges so serious that they immediately shifted the narrative from suspicion to a battle for justice. And yet, despite the severity of those charges, there was something that left many people stunned. He was not behind bars. Instead of sitting in a detention facility awaiting trial, he was placed under house supervision, monitored with an ankle device, living in a private residence. For many following the case, this decision felt almost impossible to understand. How could someone accused of such a violent crime be allowed to remain outside of custody? Legally, the answer comes down to one principle: presumption of innocence. Until proven guilty, he is not considered a criminal in the eyes of the law. His age also plays a significant role. Being a minor, even one charged as an adult, introduces factors that courts must weigh carefully, including the likelihood of flight, danger to the community, and psychological considerations. But for the public, for those hearing the details of what Anna endured, that explanation often feels insufficient. Because while the legal system emphasizes rights and procedure, the emotional reality tells a different story. A girl lost her life. And the person accused of taking it was sleeping in a home, not a cell. As the legal process moved forward, both sides began shaping their arguments. The prosecution would focus on the brutality of the act, the evidence collected, and the sequence of events that pointed toward deliberate, intentional behavior. They would highlight the reported struggle, the injuries, and the efforts made to conceal the body. To them, this was not confusion or accident. This was a calculated act of violence. The defense, on the other hand, faced the challenge of addressing those same facts from a completely different angle. Their focus would likely center on the defendant's mental state. At 16, the brain is still developing. Impulse control, decision-making, emotional regulation, all of these are still in progress. They may argue that he was not fully capable of understanding the consequences of his actions, or that he was experiencing some form of psychological break. Two narratives, both built from the same night, both fighting for acceptance in a courtroom. And then there's the behavior that continues to raise questions. Reports indicated that after the incident, he joined the rest of the family for breakfast, sat among them, ate, acted as though everything was normal. It wasn't until Anna's body was discovered that his demeanor changed, becoming withdrawn, emotional, unable, or unwilling to speak. To some, that shift suggests shock. To others, it suggests something else entirely. Because when you place that behavior next to the alleged attempt to hide the body, next to the reported effort to isolate the victim, next to the sounds of violence heard through the door, it creates a pattern that is difficult to ignore. And yet the courtroom is not built on feelings, it is built on proof. Every claim must be backed by evidence. Every detail must be tested, challenged, and confirmed. DNA results, forensic reports, witness statements, all of it will be scrutinized. Nothing is assumed. Nothing is taken at face value. That is how justice works. But beyond the courtroom, there are questions that don't require legal standards to feel important. Questions about responsibility, about awareness, about the decisions that led to that night. Why were earlier warnings not taken seriously? Why was Anna placed in a situation where she reportedly felt unsafe? Why did no one intervene when signs of conflict were already present? These are questions that may never be answered in a legal sense, but they remain at the center of the story. And then there's the broader scope. The setting itself, a cruise ship, adds another layer of complexity. Thousands of people, confined in one space, monitored by security systems, surrounded by staff trained to ensure safety. Could something have been noticed sooner? Should there have been intervention when noise and disturbance were reported? Was there surveillance that captured movement, timing, or behavior? These questions open the door to potential civil action. Not necessarily about guilt in the crime, but about whether more could have been done to prevent it or respond to it. Because safety, especially in controlled environments like that, is not just expected, it's promised. And when that promise feels broken, accountability extends beyond just one individual. But even as those conversations unfold, it's important not to lose sight of the center of this story. Anna, a teenager with plans, with goals, with a future that stretched far beyond that cruise ship. She had dreams of joining the Navy, of building a life, of becoming something more. All of that was taken in a matter of hours, inside a place where she should have felt secure. Now, her story is no longer about what she would become. It's about what happened to her, and whether justice will truly be served. Because justice is not just about a verdict. It's about truth. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that something like this doesn't happen again. And as this case continues to unfold, one thing remains certain. The answers matter. Before we close, don't forget to subscribe to Midnight Casefiles. Like this video, comment your thoughts, and share it with others. Your voice helps keep stories like Anna's alive, and ensures they are never forgotten. Because behind every case file, there's a real person. And behind every story like this, there's a truth waiting to be uncovered. Until that truth is fully revealed, this case remains open, not just in court, but in the minds of everyone still asking, what really happened in that cabin?